Well, as the noted sports broadcaster Jim Nance would always say when he began a broadcast, welcome friends. I want to take this time to welcome everybody to the first ever DACC woodworking class at Denellen High School. I'm John Shimko. I've been here now for 43 and a half years, and it was the first time that ever a class actually took hold. People had talked about it for a long time, but I want to thank the people at the DACC for really making this happen. It's one of those things where I always thought would be intriguing, but when I was approached with the idea and knowing that there could be some major changes into the wood shop next year, figured this would be a good time to welcome everybody on board. First of all, you had the courage to take this class, which is really unusual because most people shy away from sharp blades, machinery, sharp tools, and dangerous situations. But as I often tell my students each and every day, you take a risk every time you walk into the shop. So hopefully I'll minimize the risk. I'll put your mind at ease. I'll try to do most of the thinking for you. And you guys can concentrate on procedures, techniques, and processes that we use in the shop, and possibly you might use outside of the shop to take your woodworking career to new heights. So let's start at the first step. There is a video that I will include about how to read a standard English ruler, which is what we do in here. It's very important that you understand how to use one of these guys, but I think as adults, most people are pretty familiar with our inches, half inches, quarter inches, eighth inches, and 16 inches on a standard English ruler. But if you need a little brush up, I'll send that video to you. Today, what I wanted to do was to talk to you about the project that you're gonna make, namely a garden bench. That bench was designed sort of by me, but with the help of my wife, Ann, who said, we need something for all these plants around this deck. Could you make something? And after years and years and years of struggling with house construction and woodworking instruction in the shop, I said to her, well, I'll make something, but I sure as heck am not gonna sand anything. And she said, okay, it's gonna be for exterior use. Just come up with an idea and see what you can do with it. So that's where I am. I came up with this idea, as a matter of fact, implemented this into our advanced students curriculum. Our second, third, and fourth year students at Denellen High School are required to make this garden bench. Now, the thing that's gonna be different about this than what they were assigned is that you're going to put a finish on this depending on how you want to place this. Do you want this as a garden bench to sit outside, put plants on, do a little thinking in the garden? Or would you choose to use this bench as almost like an entryway into your house? I know a lot of people take their shoes off when they enter into an abode. So as a result, it is now proportioned exactly to the height of my back for me to take my shoes off. So you can use it as a dual purpose. You can use it outside, exterior, or if you wanted to, you can use it inside, interior, and dress it up a little bit more. But that's certainly going to be up to you. I wanted to introduce to you some vital parts of the shop that are important before we ever start. Something that I had to think about, and I'm just gonna sort of share this with you as you start the construction process. Number one, before we do anything in here, of course, you have to know how to read that standard English ruler. But the second thing we want to become familiar with is something that I often drum into my students' head, a good plan, a bill of materials, something that lists all the piece parts that make up the project. So when we start to do things and cut things, we're cutting them to exacting standards and measurements so that things will fit together. If you look at the board, and I've written this here, and also will include this in a close-up snapshot, my bill of materials has been laid out here, all the piece parts that make up the project, almost in the order that I'm going to construct them, so that this whole thing goes together. And the thing that I want you to note, especially on the photo that I share with you, is the fact that on all these parts, and here's the parts to a leg, and I know it's difficult to see, but all of the sizes are expressed by 3 measurements. And it's important to understand that all boards, and it really kills me when people refer to them as planks. We don't really have a plank here. We have a board or that stick. Well, it's not really a stick. Everything, no matter the size, the shape, is a 3-dimensional object. So if you look at that piece, which happens to be different than this piece, which happens to be different than this piece, all of them have a unique size that we're going to use to describe the parts that make up this project. There's one clue to all of these parts, and it's the one thing that you have to understand mentally, because I can't share with you going into a sawmill and actually cutting up one of these. But if you imagine a tree that grows a tree that grows, if you look at how this thing starts to take shape, you notice the bark on the outside, but it's growing in this direction. Of course, it's not growing in that direction. It's growing vertically, not horizontally. When a board has been machined, it's taken to the sawmill, it's debarked. After it's debarked, it's run through a series of cleaners, and then it's sliced, whether it's on a bandsaw like we have one in the back, or the table saw like we have by the doors. It's sliced into what we refer to as boards in here. And the one clue that determines absolutely everything on this and every single piece in the shop is grain. Grain are those lines that actually run up and down on a tree. A lot of times when you cut the tree, I hear these genius people look into the tree and say, well, that tree was 27 years old. Well, how'd you get that, Mr. So-and-so, Mr. Flanagan? Well, I counted those annual rings. Well, if you take those annual rings, take this tree, send it through a sawmill, you are cutting this tree into longitudinal lines. We're actually going in the shape that the direction that tree grows in. So when I look at this and I see these lines, which happens to end up on every single naturally occurring board in this shop, it exposes these grain lines. And grain lines run in general directions. I can tell that this tree happened to grow this way because the grain lines are running this way. The grain lines here, if I position it this way, are running this way. So grain lines are one clue to determine the 3 parts that make up every single board. Now, I'm going to use kind of general rules in here. I know there's exceptions to all these rules, and if you've had my class before, you're going to hear something, you go, I don't know, Shimko, I don't know that that's actually 100% correct. But I'll tell you the general rule in here is that the area that happens to be the biggest on every single board in this shop, whether it's this part here or the part that's in the back, the biggest area, and it's generally the case, is referred to as a surface. So this happens to be the surface of this board, and the opposite, where I showed you the grain lines, that's the other surface of the board. So every single board in this shop has 2 surfaces. The biggest area, and I'm just using that in general terms. The other thing that I want to describe when we take a look at the grain is how these grain lines run. And we all know 2 specific definitions. We use the term often parallel and perpendicular. So if the grain lines are running in the general shape, which is that direction, the part that runs parallel to the direction of the grain, meaning this area here and this area over here, if you look at the way that runs, the part that runs parallel to the direction of the grain are referred to as edges. And I happen to have 2 edges. I have an edge here, and the other edge is in the opposite direction. So directly across from one another, running parallel to the direction of this grain, are edges. And finally, the term perpendicular. Well, if the grain is running in this direction, this part right over here forms a 90-degree angle to the direction of the grain. This part right here, as well as this part, forming 90-degree angles, are both referred to as ends. So I have an end here, the grain's running in this direction. I have an end right over here, and I have another end right here. So all boards, not planks, all boards in our shop happen to have two surfaces, they happen to have two edges, and they happen to have two ends. And we're going to use those to determine the size of every single board. Now, you go into Home Depot, you walk down the lumber aisle, and you notice there's stacks and stacks of material. There's stacks over here, over here, over here, and they all have different numbers. And usually there's two numbers, but the last number that they refer to is usually the length of the board. In other words, when I walk in, I see this stack of barrel studs, and they're beautiful, they look nice, and here's a big sign that says 2 by 4, and at the end it'll say 8 foot. So it's giving me a measurement 2 by 4, 8 feet. What does that mean? I'm actually taking what we already talked about, the measurement from surface to surface to get the thickness of that board. So if I measure from this surface to this surface, I can do it anywhere from here, here, here. I'm going to get a number, and that number will correspond to the thickness of the board. When I walk into Home Depot, of course, the 2 by 4s happen to be pieces of wood that are 2 inches thick. The width of the board is going to be the distance measured from edge to edge. So remember we talked about this edge, and we said it's across from this other edge. If I take a measurement from this edge to this edge, I get a measurement going across the grain, which we'll refer to as the width of the board. And finally, if I take a measurement from one end all the way to the other end, or the direction going along the grain, I'm referring to that as the length. So when we take a look at any board, again, not plank in the shop, of course, many of you will refer to that when you walk in here. If I take a measurement, and I take a measurement from the surface to the surface, I'm going to get the thickness. If I take a measurement from edge to edge, if the grain's running in this direction, this is an edge, that's the width. And finally, if I take a measurement from this end, because the grain's running in this direction all the way down here, that will refer to as the length of the board. So we're using board parts. In other words, we're using the surface to surface measurement, the measurement from edge to edge to get the width of the board, and the measurement from end to end to get the length of the board. So parts give us sizes. So when you walk into Home Depot now and you look at a piece of wood that happens to be a 2 by 6 by 10 feet, it's referring to a piece of wood that's 2 inches thick, 6 inches wide, and 10 feet long. So now you kind of get an idea what that looks like, or in your mind. But here's a little secret. Is a 2 by 4 2 inches thick and 4 inches wide? It's not. Because every board that's sold to us in a lumber yard has to be touchable. I say it has to be it has to look good. So what they have done is literally taken a board that was 2 inches thick and surface it down so this becomes smooth and touchable. They do it over here and they do it on this side. So if you take your handy dandy tape measure, of course, that I dropped on the floor, and you take a measurement from one surface to the other surface with those barrel studs at Home Depot, you're not going to get a measurement of 2 inches. You're actually going to get a measurement of 1.5 inches. And the same thing is true with the width. When they tell you that the width is 4 inches wide, it really isn't, because they've taken the liberty to machine this edge, again, so it's touchable. I don't get splinters. I don't see saw marks. It's marketable. So a 2 by 4 is actually a piece of wood that's 1.5 inches thick, and it's really, instead of 4 inches wide, it's 3.5 inches wide. Now the length is the length. They leave that alone. But they've machined it so that you can use it, but understand that what they say oftentimes is not true. In other words, if I go to maybe Jaeger Lumber because I want to buy a piece of pine, pine is sold to me as a one buy. One buy. Okay, that means that it's 1 inch thick, but is it really? If I look at a piece of pine, a nice piece of pine, it won't be 1 inch thick. It will actually be 3/4 of an inch. Why? Because they've done the same thing. They've surfaced it down. So they clean up one surface, clean up the other surface. You're paying for it. They take 1/4 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch off the top, 1/8 of an inch off the bottom. So a 1 by pine is really 3/4 of an inch. And the same thing is true with the width. With pine, if I buy a 1 by 12, it is really sold nominally, the real number being 11 1/4 inches. So they take 3/8 off of one side, 3/8 off of another side, and then they sell it to me as a 1 by 12. Again, the length stays the same, but that 1 by 12 is really 3/4 of an inch thick and only 11 1/4 inches wide. It's something to think about. Why is this important to us? Because on my bill of materials, which you see here and you'll get a close-up of, these are the actual numbers. This is not when you go into Home Depot and you buy a 2x4. These are actual numbers that we're going to work with. And it's important that you understand that when you start, as we begin to machine the process of these boards into our garden bench. I hope that this was informative to you, and there'll be plenty more videos as we go along. So I guess I say goodbye, friends, for now. But thanks again, and I'll certainly be in touch.